Okay, we're live. Did you hear me, Martin?
I did not hear you, no, but now I...
Oh, yeah, we're live.
Great. Thanks, Emerald. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Research Showcase in May 2022. We are back after a break in April for Wiki Workshop. My name is Martin Gerlach. I'm a research scientist here at the Wikimedia Foundation, and I have the pleasure to introduce today's speakers. The theme we have today, it revolves around gaps and biases. The research team at the Wikimedia Foundation is very active in this space. The topic lies at the heart of our research program to address knowledge gaps towards the strategic direction of knowledge equity. If you want to learn more about that, I encourage you to check out our white paper. We have recently published an update to our original 2019 version. And in this update, we reflect on what we have done in these 3 years, what we have learned so far towards the strategic direction, and we revisit the research questions in the original white paper and look to the future of the research on this topic. I will share a link in the chat if you're curious. But with this, I am very, very excited about today's presentations. First, we have Francesca Tripodi, an assistant professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She will talk about miscategorized, gender, notability, and inequality in Wikipedia. And in the second half, we will have Julia Cvetkov. She's an assistant professor at University of Washington. And she will be talking about controlled analysis of social biases in Wikipedia bios. I want to thank both of them for joining us today and share their research with us. And I want to mention again that at the end of each talk, we'll have time for Q&A. So if you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the chat or on IRC. My colleague Pablo will monitor those and relay the questions here, and we try to answer them. Before we start, one announcement I want to make is that about the Wikimedia Hackathon, which will happen this weekend from May 19 to May 21. The research team will host a community session on Saturday focused on bridging the developer and research communities. And I will also post a link if you're curious to check it out. We cordially invite you to join us there. And now, without further ado, I'll pass it on to Francesca for the talk.
Thank you so much. All right, let me share. I have some slides just because Zoom can otherwise get boring. I'm really excited to be here today, and I just want to express my appreciation to be able to share my work with you all. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about how notable women are regularly categorized as non-notable and nominated for deletion. And for those of you listening either in this group or on YouTube, I'd love to connect on Twitter. I've posted my Twitter handle here, and I encourage you to live tweet this talk so we can continue to connect after this is over. And before I get started, I just want to first acknowledge how amazing I think Wikipedia is. I mean, it's one of the largest databases of information in the world, and continuously in peer review studies demonstrates that it's remarkably accurate. It's a global phenomenon, and the fact that it is free and open source is what allows researchers like me to do the work that I care about. And so for that, I am extremely grateful. Nonetheless, those of us on this call, I'm sure, also recognize that there is a big gender problem, and a lot of research both internally and externally has looked at what is colloquially referred to as the gender gap. And this is largely bridged in two spaces. You've got the editorial gap, where we know that Men are much more likely to make up the editorial majority. Researchers have described how the pipeline for encouraging female participation is broken, and that women have to consider a lot of safety risks before they edit. We also know that there's a content gap. So women, and this is specifically my research looks at English language Wikipedia, but others have also documented that women's interests are underrepresented, underdeveloped, and often feature gendered language like first female, mayor, and that women still make up less than 20% of the biographies on English language Wikipedia. Now, to try and close this gap, editors have organized a lot of events, these edit-a-thons that encourage new editors, and based on my observations, these are often women, to add articles to Wikipedia, often about women. So there are these things in place to try and close both the content and editorial gap. And while these do not exclusively revolve around closing the gender gap, I also want to throw a quick shout out to networks like Women in Red, which focused exclusively on creating content regarding women's biographies, women's work, and women's issues. And their name actually derives from the practice of turning red links, pages that don't yet exist on Wikipedia, into blue or active pages. And because of their work, this gender gap is shrinking. It was at edit-a-thons designed to close the gender gap that my qualitative research began. And this research included ethnographic observations at multiple edit-a-thons from 2016 through 2017. I also attended large-scale Wikipedia events, smaller meetups like happy hours, and regional chapter meetings. And I supplemented these observations with in-depth interviews with 33 individuals, 23 who identified as Wikipedians, and 10 new editors that I met at the edit-a-thons I was attending. And it was through this ethnographic observation that I learned about articles for deletion, which y'all refer to as AFD. So AFD is how I'm going to refer to it for the rest of this presentation. And AFD is the space where Wikipedians examine articles, add to discussion about the merits of the article, and determine whether or not something should be kept, deleted, merged, etc. And it's also, I think, important to understand, and what's interesting about Wikipedia and Wikipedians is that they tend to stick in certain spaces. So I've learned that even though many might identify as Wikipedians, they all might not know what they're doing. So I think it's important to also know that the decision about what to keep or delete on Wikipedia is really fraught with a lot of contestation, and that this is drawn around reputability of a source, the political nature of a subject, whether an article was written in a neutral tone or not, and whether or not it's worthy for inclusion. And largely this breaks into two camps. You have deletionists who believe that articles that cover obscure content or don't receive significant attention actually weaken the encyclopedic nature of the site. And then you also have inclusionists who favor more of a long tail approach to Wikipedia, given the nearly limitless space constraints of the internet. And I also think it's important to note here that deletions are sometimes extremely important because harassment, doxing, and horrible stuff gets put onto Wikipedia. And editors do an incredible job of conducting that janitorial work to make sure that the site stays reputable, and also make sure that biographies about people aren't being created as a form of harassment. Nonetheless, research on deletions have revealed that the most frequently used rationale for deleting an article has less to do with deleting defamatory content and much more to do with whether or not a subject was deemed notable. The notability on Wikipedia is determined by a couple of ways, but largely it's whether or not the topic or the subject has received significant coverage in reliable sources that are independent of the subject. Editors can also evaluate wiki notability using what's referred to as the search engine test. So as an act of good faith, editors should search for a topic and attempt to find a reliable source before deciding on whether or not an article is notable enough for inclusion. I also like to note here that a lot of really non-notable people try to sneak onto Wikipedia, and they do it to boost products that they're selling, or maybe to try to land acting jobs. There's quite a lucrative business in paying publicists to write biographies for people. And so questioning the notability of biographies is an important process. However, my qualitative data revealed that women who were being deemed not notable were not obscure people, and they actually met Wikipedia standards for inclusion. So this is what actually happened to Lois K. Alexander Lane. For those of you who might not be familiar, Lane founded two museums, the Harlem Institute of Fashion and the Black Fashion Museum. She wrote a book. She ran two boutiques. She designed her own clothes. And not only did her museum memorialize the contribution of prominent Black stylists, including the work of Anne Lowe, who designed Jackie O's wedding gown, Lane also used space to give free courses in writing, math, English, and African American history. When she died in 2007, the Washington Post ran an obituary detailing her accomplishments, and her fashion archive was considered so incredible, it's now on display at the Smithsonian National Museum for African American History and Culture. Despite her professional accomplishments, Lane incredibly did not have a Wikipedia page until 8 years after she died. And through data matching, I found that the biography for Lane was created during an edit-a-thon designed to increase coverage for African American women on Wikipedia. But according to the edit's history, the submission of Lane's biography on March 19th, 2016 was denied because she was a person not yet shown to meet notability guidelines. If you analyze the state of the original article, it's clear that the preliminary entry included basic biographical and professional information, as well as links to credible sources independent of the subject, including the Washington Post and the Smithsonian. A simple Google search for her revealed her notability. So indeed, classifying women who have achieved great accomplishments as inadequate for inclusion was actually fitting a trend that I was documenting in my ethnographic observations and in my interviews. During my interviews with established Wikipedians, the frustration regarding this classification was palpable. Take this example from Brenna, a woman who volunteers much of her free time to adding women to Wikipedia. Side note, none of these are real names. These are pseudonyms to protect anonymity. In our interview, she described how the biography of a woman who pioneered the radio was quickly nominated for deletion after she tried to create her page. She described how within a couple of hours, it was flagged because people on the top page were saying, I don't think she's a notable figure. I don't think she's worthy of inclusion. She felt really frustrated because her work was having to be doubled down. In her own words, you have to work twice as hard to prove that content about women is valuable and worthy of inclusion. Brenna's observations were echoed by Matt, an editor who spends much of his time in AFD discussions. He conducted an informal analysis of articles he saw being nominated for deletion and noted that topics that deal with women generally or biographies in specific were more heavily scrutinized than men. During edit-a-thons, I noticed that Wikipedians would add articles they helped mentor to their watch lists to ensure that they would stick around. And so I asked Janet, an academic in her mid-50s that encourages classroom participation on Wikipedia, why editors were doing this. I learned from her that it was common for women being added at these events, being edit-a-thons, to be immediately flagged for deletion or sent to AFD, where they would experience further sexism. Unfortunately, if editors wanted to defend their articles, they had to head over to AFD, a place that many I interviewed described as not a particularly welcoming place. Margaret, a passionate female editor in her 20s, who regularly organized edit-a-thons for improving coverage about women, put it pretty bluntly, describing AFD as one of the most male and most sexist places on Wikipedia. And these observations got me wondering, were notable men being nominated for deletion at the same rate? And so in order to test what I was seeing, I had to first identify what I was witnessing. At the time, this concept of miscategorization didn't have a name, but I knew I wanted to capture it and analyze it. And essentially what I did is I partnered with a data scientist who wrote a script that scraped articles for deletion daily log pages from 2017 through 2020. And then we used that metadata and filtered out for tags or phrases that indicated the entry in question was biography. We exported that to a CSV file and cleaned it up using Wikidata to match for pronoun use, which is how we determined gender, as well as the decision rendered, and the rest were manually coded and exported. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. The total number of biographies we analyzed over a 3-year period was over 22,000. And then I used descriptive statistics to determine the percentage of nominations that were what I referred to as miscategorized, and then relied on chi-square analysis to determine if the inequality I was witnessing was actually happening at a wider scale, like whether or not the sample was proportionate. Ultimately, I was trying to test if the process was equal. So if the process of nominating articles for deletion is not biased by gender, then the percentage of articles about women nominated should account for roughly the same proportion. And if no bias exists, the percentage of miscategorizations should also not vary by gender. My data set revealed that the proportion of women nominated for deletion each month was much greater than the proportion of available biographies about women, more generally. So as you can see, networks like Women in Red are making an impact incrementally, right? So from January 2017 through February 2020, the number of biographies about women on English language Wikipedia rose from 16.83% to 18.25%. As of Women in Red's page's latest numbers as of May 9th of this year, the percentage now has reached 19.25%. Yet the percentage of biographies about women nominated for deletion each month was consistently over 25%. In some months, this was much higher. So for example, in April 2017, women only made up about 16.93% of available biographies, this is according to Women in Red's data, but made up over 41% of the biographies nominated for deletion that month. So even though women still make up less than 20% of available biographies on English language Wikipedia, women routinely make up a quarter of the biographies nominated for deletion on any given month. My data also indicated that women's biographies are more frequently miscategorized. So on average, 19% of biographies nominated for deletion are kept, but roughly 25% of women's biographies are miscategorized, whereas 17% of men's are miscategorized. Now, the statistical significance and the real significance of this observed difference in my findings strongly supports the patterns that I identified first in my ethnographic observations. So I always like to take a quick moment to say qualitative data is real data. It demonstrates that Wikipedians trying to close the gender gap have to work nearly twice as hard, as Brenna said, to prove that women are notable. So as my qualitative and quantitative data demonstrate, the problem of underrepresentation on Wikipedia runs deeper than simply missing pages. Not only are Wikipedia's notability criteria a barrier for women, even women who meet these stringent guidelines for inclusion are still more likely than men to be considered non-notable and nominated for deletion. Overall, my research suggests that a subject's gender, like their pronoun use or forename, is being used to make snap judgments regarding perceived relevance. And such a finding indicates that gender discrimination is multi-layered and reveals the extra hurdles women face when trying to establish cultural significance. Of course, some could, and many do, I've received many an email, interpreting my data to conclude that more keeps mean the mechanisms of Wikipedia are working. So while it's true that a keep decision means the biography was saved from deletion, it also means that the editors trying to close the gender gap must ultimately be on standby if they want biographies they create to persist. This perpetuates a narrative that women need saving, and it's a system that's bound to break, meaning that some are going to fall through the cracks. Even content that is added and protected by established networks like Women in Red can still be deleted. And as Women in Red archive alerts indicate, a significant number of notable women that this network has added have unfortunately already turned back to red, meaning that their page did, but now no longer exists on Wikipedia. And these setbacks have ripple effects, because even if just a few notable women are mistakenly deleted, it poses significant hurdles for closing the gender gap. For example, biographies created by Women in Red were subsequently deleted, and it took this network 17 months to make up that lost ground. So what this data is saying is that even when systems are designed to ensure that notable women are in fact kept, they are bound to fail if women are disproportionately considered non-notable to begin with. Volunteers already devote hundreds of hours organizing events, identifying notable women, pulling sources that demonstrate their notability. So ensuring that the biographies that they add are kept only adds to the emotional labor and time it takes to decrease the gender bias, making it feel like a never-ending climb. And this additional work may also contribute to more women editors quitting Wikipedia over time. Moreover, if an editor wants to cast a keep vote for a miscategorized article, it means that they have to participate in AFD, a space where many editors that I interviewed don't feel safe in participating. In fact, a few told me that they felt so uncomfortable in AFD exchanges that they don't even participate in the discussions of biographies, even if they're invested in their survival. Unfortunately, what happens on Wikipedia doesn't stay on Wikipedia, right? I mean, all of you know this. It's this open access, amazing resource. And so it's used by large tech giants because it's free, right? So Google uses it to create their knowledge panels. Wikidata is used to teach AI systems like Alexi and Suri. If you've ever wanted one of those coveted blue checks from Twitter, you have to establish your notability by providing Twitter a link to a stable Wikipedia article about your organization that meets Wikipedia's notability standards. So as we can see, devaluing the significance of women's subjects holds wider implications than just Wikipedia representation and provides a broader understanding of how women's accomplishments are valued in our society. My findings enhance and expand upon a lot of really reputable research that demonstrates that Wikipedia's evaluative mechanisms for inclusion are unequivocally connected to gender bias. And my findings also replicate sociological studies from the 1960s that show that demonstrate that men are routinely considered worthier and more valuable than women. My research also calls attention to the limitations of pronoun use. So when gender clearly shapes perceived notability, whether implicitly or explicitly, we have to consider the way that these his/her dichotomies maintain hierarchies. And most importantly, it documents the real struggles women face to be seen as notable subjects and highlights that when women go missing on Wikipedia or when their notability is questioned, that absence reverberates throughout the 21st century, impacting nearly every way we might learn about their accomplishments. That's all I have for right now. I'm really excited to talk with you all a little bit more after hearing Julia's talk.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for the talk. I think we have a bit of time for some questions. I'll start. If you're in the room here in the call, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself.
I really started speeding up because since I did the test, I thought I had a lot less. I thought I was going way over, so I ended up going under, but that's okay.
No, you're perfectly on time. I think no. This is all perfect.
Okay, good.
Very good. So yes, anyone in the room here, if you have a question for Francesca.
I have, okay, I'm sorry.
No, go on, Shobha.
Okay, great. Dr. Tripodi, can you, firstly, great, thank you so much for your talk. It was very insightful. The question that I have is, can you talk a little bit more about your methodology in terms of when you were talking about how you scrape data, because it does seem quite overwhelming. So can you?
Yeah, no, it was totally overwhelming. And this is why it took me like, I think 5 years to get this project done. So I was fortunate enough to be a dissertation fellow at the Scholars Lab at UVA. And so through there, I was able to meet a computer scientist. His name is Eric Rochester, and he helped design the scraping tool that we use to analyze and filter AFD discussion. And that's actually available on GitHub. Anyone, if you're interested, I'm happy to share that, that code, that script that he wrote to pull and filter the AFD content. And so then that came out in this just like massive CSV file. And since I'm a sociologist who's an ethnographer, I went like manually click by click, looking at the months. So it started January 2017 was the first time he gave me this data set. And I like linked on the hyperlink, and then I would go to the AFD discussion, and then I would categorize for pronoun use, and then look at decision rendered. And obviously this took an obscene amount of time. So like January 2017 was all I had for data when I first sent this out to a journal article, and it got like immediately rejected because they were like, this is not enough data to prove anything that you're trying to say. And so thankfully, I'm actually collaborating with two amazing women right now, one of whom is also a computer scientist, and she wrote a script that allows you to data match from Wikidata. And so that allowed us to much more quickly data match people by their pronoun use and decision rendered. And then it left us with a really small corpus of non-matchables. And then we had to do the manual click on the link, go to the page, through talk, determine whether or not it was a male or female based on pronoun use, and then decision rendered. And then from that data set, I did just a descriptive statistics to look at percentages, and then just did a chi-square analysis at the end because the reviewer made me do it. But I felt like at that point, I had already had plenty of qualitative and quantitative information to demonstrate it. Does that help to?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it seems like quite a lot of work, but
it was a little, well, it also started because I was seeing all this qualitative research. And so I was trying to publish my qualitative findings, and the reviews that I got back were like, this is anecdotal, this like, maybe women just aren't that notable, like really just rude. And then it made me be like, I need to prove this some other way. So then that's when, thankfully, I had the Scholars Lab fellowship, and we saw how we could back what I was seeing qualitatively through quantitative research as well.
I have one question.
Sorry, Shoba, we have lots of questions in the queue.
Okay. I'll reach out
to get everyone.
Please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to
Isaac, if you wanted to follow up, or otherwise we
can take some YouTube questions, and I can always look
good.
Back.
Then I'll pass it. Then I pass it to Pablo. I think there's quite a bit of questions from YouTube.
Yeah, there are already many questions and discussions. Actually, the first question by Jan Ainali already started some discussion. He was wondering whether like, anyone self-identified as a deletionist. And Martin, there was a discussion around that because there has been some evidence of users already self-declaring that, and there is an article being shared in the YouTube chat about deletionists and inclusionists in Wikipedia, but we don't know if this is something that you have considered for your analysis as well.
No, absolutely. Unfortunately, my interviews didn't really look at people who identified as either inclusionists or deletionists. My interviews came out of my ethnographic observations of edit-a-thons. So I was looking specifically at Wikipedians who were committed to closing the gender gap and adding articles onto the site.
Okay, that's very clear. The second question comes from David Ramirez Ordóñez. He's interested in knowing if there is access to the script to try this by their own.
Access to which? I'm sorry.
To the script.
To the script? Yeah, it's up on GitHub. So I couldn't list it because like when you're blind reviewed, like I actually had it listed in my footnotes, so I changed that to like available upon request. But anyway, I've shared the GitHub code to with a bunch of people. To be fair, the code was written in 2017, so it might need some cleanup because it did take me like 4 years to analyze this data set. But yeah, I'm open to sharing that the scrape with anyone who's interested. it just populates like a massive CSV file that then requires a significant amount of cleanup, which, you know, I'm forthcoming with telling people that as well.
Great. We will try to save it in the YouTube chat. The third question is by Michel Duvecot. He's noting that anyone can nominate an article for deletion, even new users. So he's asking whether, like, have you broken down the proportion of mistaken nominations by experience of the nominators?
I mean, that's a great thing. I don't know how I would be able to determine the level of whether or not someone was experienced or non-experienced by just a username. That would require like a pretty significant undertaking. But yeah, of course, I mean, to be clear, you know, I think there were some patterns where there was like the same username that I kept seeing over and over and over again, that felt like more of a targeted deletion. But I think by and large, these biases are implicit, right? That people are seeing, making really quick snap judgments and just being like, I'm not sure how this woman is notable. Like, who's this lady, right? And I don't think that it's because someone's necessarily like less involved in Wikipedia or more involved in Wikipedia, but rather a whole bunch of sociological research, which I am a sociologist, right? Which just shows that women tend to be undervalued, especially in the United States.
Okay, that's clear. And the final question, Sir by Esther Bonnet, she's asking if you could please talk a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about women must consider safety risk before editing.
Sure, right. So this is in a different paper that I looked at, but there were a few things that people mentioned in my edit-a-thons that I was observing. So one, the edit-a-thons take some time to help people determine what kind of username they want. And often people suggested that women choose usernames that weren't necessarily identifiable to their offline identity, just because for safety reasons. They also talked about how women would purposely choose, like more the experienced editors would suggest to those new to the edit-a-thon to choose usernames that didn't sound explicitly what they described as like feminine, because it tended to lead to unwanted attention and interaction in spaces. But then I also had interviews with people who had pretty horrible experiences with like harassment when they tried to participate in mediation or delete content. But yeah, you know, it was a pretty wide variety. I hope that answered the question.
Great.
Yes,
I think we have time.
That's the repository. Oh. Yeah, Isaac.
I will share the link to the repository in the chat.
Yeah, Isaac just did. So you're welcome to post. It's all there.
I think we have time for one more question in the room, if there's one more.
I'll take my question then, because it builds off one that Pablo was just asking about. Who are the people doing this deletion? And I would love to hear more from you, Francesca, about how you think about kind of addressing this at a structural level. So is this just things I can imagine, like, is this issues with notability criteria? Is this issues with like reliable sources maybe? Is this like changes you think maybe to the article for deletion process and how that's monitored? Or are there other kind of bigger changes that you could imagine being pursued?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, I think the process for nominating articles for deletion might be flawed. And I think it's in two ways. One, and a couple people have responded to me with this, right, which saying like proportionality, it doesn't make sense because the new articles created are often women and new articles are often flagged for deletion. And then my response is like, well, then that's not working, right? If we know that the new articles are more likely to be about women, then like maybe we need to fix that. Also, I think in a couple situations where there was perhaps like copy and paste or just the article was not well written, I think since since the documented gender gap is so significant, and I know there are a lot of Wikipedians working on closing this, you know, I recognize that not everybody deserves a Wikipedia page, but I think if a search engine test is happening, or maybe it's not happening with the same level of regularity. And so I actually have a paper under review right now, which shows that like the Google search index of a person, which documents their like media coverage ultimately, that it's like this really great predictor at determining whether or not someone is deemed notable if you're white and male. But if you're a woman or a person of color, there's no differentiation between like who gets nominated, who gets deleted, and who gets kept. So it's like this, so the search engine test does seem to be happening for some and maybe not for others. And so I do think that there are systems that could be put in place that could help improve that. Also in my data set, I didn't analyze like who are the people nominating, but there are just a lot of people that take on this work of nominating for deletion. So I would reach out, right, and just say like, hey, we have this problem that you might not know about, you know, how can we fix this, right? So those are some of the suggestions I would have.
All very good points. And also looking forward to reading that paper. I didn't realize that the index values existed. So that's, yeah, very cool.
Yeah, this woman I'm co-authoring with, she's like the smartest person. I don't even understand. I'm like, I love teaching young people are so smart. It's insane. Like, and they come to me with this stuff. They're like, I just created this code for this. And I'm like, that's amazing. So smart. Yeah, these women are extremely brilliant who I'm co-authoring with.
Great. Thank you so much for these discussions, the questions and the answers. I think in the interest of time, we should move on to the second talk. We could, if we have time, and we could revisit some of the remaining questions at the end, perhaps. But for now, thank you so much, Francesca. And I will pass it on to Julia. And yeah.
Hi, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it and we can hear you too.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I really enjoyed Francesca's talk. I feel very privileged to be here. Thank you. I'm Yulia. I work on natural language processing, so my talk will be a little bit different. We develop automatic methods and methodologies to identify content disparities on Wikipedia automatically. And I'll be focusing on people biographies too. And this work is led by my two amazing PhD students who are currently on this call too, Anjali Field and Chan Park. So I wanted to thank them before starting the talk. So of course, it goes without saying that Wikipedia is very widely read. It's an amazing, huge platform. And also, in AI, it is a huge resource, specifically in natural language processing. It is very widely used. So if we search through ACL ontology, that is one of the repositories of natural language processing research, about over 18,000 articles specifically use Wikipedia for research and findings that are related to natural language processing. The actual impact of Wikipedia on AI and NLP research is much larger because currently large language models used in practically every NLP applications, and all of these language models are trained on Wikipedia data. And there has been a lot of work on the accuracy and objectivity of content on Wikipedia. There is a lot of work on gender bias in these pages, looking at things like article lengths or overall coverage bias, and showing that articles about women tend to be longer than articles about men, or structural bias, showing that biography articles tend to link to articles about men more than women, or content bias. So this has been a very vibrant area of research. So in our own work, we also focus on people's biographies. And this is an example of the biography of Alan Turing. And overall, there are 1.5 million biographies in English alone. And in our work, we focus not only on English, but also on other languages. There are 285 different languages. And our research focuses on English, Spanish, and Russian. And in our research, we are asking a question: are there differences in how English, Spanish, and Russian Wikipedias portray people? And we specifically want to understand how different social groups are portrayed, and other subtle differences in connotations in how people are described, in addition to various statistical differences in the articles that we are studying. So this is a motivating example to our study. So let's look at in Alan Turing's Wikipedia, and it specifically focuses on one event of his life. So in 1952, he was prosecuted for being gay and subsequently underwent a hormonal injection. And these are 3 parallel sentences from Wikipedia that describe the same event. So about Alan Turing getting estrogen injections. So what we see here is that there is a subtle difference in choices of verbs that describe this event of Alan Turing's life. While English talks about, uses the verb accepted, which suggests that Alan Turing has very little control over this situation. Spanish uses the word chose, which implies more agency, and the Russian uses the verb preferred, which implies both agency and maybe even more positive sentiment towards the injection. In this way, Russian, Spanish, and English readers of these articles may form different impressions about this part of this life. So specifically, we cannot go over millions of pages and try to analyze them and try to identify these disparities. Also, I have seen, kind of after Francesca's talk, I'm amazed how she did it at scale manually. So what we are focusing on is how to automatically identify those disparities. And the reason we are doing it, one is to be able to automatically surface candidate articles that might be more likely to contain disparities, that people further would like to analyze them. And 2, we would like to identify articles and potentially be able to analyze training data to natural language processing models and understand how to balance, to filter it, because it has been shown that large deep learning models are liable to absorb and amplify subtle biases in data. So if we see a lot of consistent and biases across articles, these biases will be significantly amplified in Google search, in dialogue systems, in machine translation, and other downstream natural language processing tools. So we identify a couple of limitations of prior research in how to surface and in how to analyze articles at scale. One important limitation is that if we look at this example, if we try to take all men-associated articles and try to take all women-associated articles and try to surface only words that are overrepresented in male articles versus female articles, in addition to gendered pronouns and other gendered words, we would identify words that are associated with sports, season, league, and club. And these results that we find through a quick automatic analysis are also supported by prior research. sports terms are prevalent in prior work on analyzing men versus women biography pages. And a naive conclusion would be to imply that Wikipedia editors omit the football achievements of men and women. But it is not necessarily true. I think a more accurate answer is that we cannot tell whether the disparities that we reveal in analysis of men versus women articles come from the differences in how Wikipedia editors describe sports achievements of men and women, or maybe this is just a reflection of disparities in society, in which we know that sports topics are, sports professions are more dominant among men than among women. And then what we kind of want to emphasize here is that there might be disparities, but sports topic is a confounder in the analysis that we would like to conduct. So the question that we would like to ask is how to control for various confounders. If we want to analyze gender, how can we control for occupation and for many, many other properties that people might have and might be imbalanced in the set of articles on Wikipedia. And the second limitation that we would like to point out to is that there is a huge disparity in the kind of social groups that got a lot of attention from prior research on disparities on Wikipedia. There has been a disproportional attention to gender, although we as a group of female researchers, we believe that it is very, very important. But also prior research has shown that Wikipedia editors are predominantly white and male, and that cultural background is a big motivator in why people edit Wikipedia. And maybe there are also racial and other kind of disparities that we would like to focus on in this automated analysis. So to summarize kind of our motivation, in this work, we focus on examination of systemic biases of Wikipedia biography articles, focusing on race, gender, and sexual orientation. And our contribution is that we develop a methodology to reduce the influence of confounding variables and isolate the dimension of interest, for example, gender or race, while we're controlling for occupation, but also for 100 other potential confounders. And then we develop a methodology to build a corpus of different biography pages, which can be comparable and can serve for further analysis by Wikipedia editors. And also we develop a natural language processing methodology to automatically analyze how people are portrayed in terms of how powerful they are, how positively they're portrayed, how much agency they have, as I showed in a motivating example with Alan Turing's biography page. And these are the two papers that I'm describing right now, if you would like to look at them later. So the first part is specifically how to select articles for further analysis. And in this work, we would like to isolate the attributes such as occupation, religion, geography, from the attributes of interest, such as gender or race or sexual orientation. And what we do, we develop a matching algorithm to construct a comparison group that matches the target corpus, which is, for example, a gender-specific corpus, on as many attributes as possible, except the target one. So I will go very briefly on this methodology, skipping a lot of details. So given a target corpus, we take a set of articles that we want to compare against. And typically our target corpus can be much smaller than the control corpus. So if our target corpus is that we would like to analyze articles about cisgender women, the control corpus or the set of articles about cisgender men will be much larger. And what we want to do, rather than analyzing all articles about women compared to all articles about men, we would like to create a balanced corpus in which the distribution of all attributes except gender will be similar. So this is a goal. How do we get there? We start from a target corpus. In this case, the corpus about cisgender women, the corpus of biographies of cisgender women. And we would like to search the most similar articles in the comparison corpus of cisgender men. And the way we would like to search for similarity between articles is we would focus on this bottom part of metadata of the articles. And we would compare the traits of people that describe different biographies. So every article is annotated with the potentially long list of traits, and examples include things like 20th century American politicians. And these categories are clearly visible to readers and writers. And these are traits that might affect how the articles are written. So given that we have the set of traits for every article, we want to look for another article that has a very similar set of traits. It matches all of these traits except for our target trait, which in our current presentation is gender. A naive approach would be to look just at the intersection of traits. But we find that using the intersection of traits, the matching is not very good. We only find articles that have just more, the longer lists, and they are dominating the comparison. So the contribution of our work is that we show how to match the articles on the left side to the articles on the right side. And specifically, we'll create term frequency, inverse document frequency, TF, IDF vectors that correspond to the categories of people. And also we do a correction, pivot slope correction. That is a method used in, frequently used in causal inference to balance for the lengths and of the sets of properties and the frequency of those properties across the data. So in this way, and then we use cosine similarity to compare the two vectors. The vector of the left is TF-IDF vector of properties for cisgender women. The vector on the right is the same vector for cisgender men. And for every corpus on the left, we find the article that matches the most the article on the right. Why individual pairs of people do not match, we cannot compare, we cannot say these are comparable biographies, but overall, what we achieve is two sets of articles that are of the same size, and the distribution of properties of people is as similar as possible, except for our target attribute. So now I will be skipping the evaluation and moving directly to results. I'm happy to talk about it. So we construct a data set of living people on Wikipedia, and we discard articles that have too little categories or stubs. We use categories from English. We only focus on people traits on the bottom of the article. And our final corpus contains of 444,000 articles, containing on average 10 categories, on average 600 token lengths. Oops, sorry. And I can skip how we extract social attributes, but in this work, we focus on two attributes, on gender and on race. And overall, we compare 4 different races and 5 different genders. So for race, we focus on African American, Asian American, Hispanic, and our control group is unmarked American, which is often corresponds to white American, but not always, and we discuss it in the paper. And we have 5 genders when our control group is cisgender men. And this, you can see the sizes of the data sets. And then given these sets of pairs of, sets of Wikipedia biographies that are paired by social attribute, we now can conduct a statistical analysis and compare this corpora by lengths, by availability of language for this corpora, by counts of edits for these articles, by article age, and so on. And there are, of course, several limitations to this research, which I can just say briefly that this analysis may not capture multiple additional types of bias that we can focus on. And this really relies on category information, which might not always be extremely accurate. And also, it does not explain the origin of disparity. Nevertheless, we think we have some interesting findings. So first, going to our motivating example, when we now match the articles about cisgender men versus cisgender women, we don't see that sports terms really dominate one corpus versus another. And if we do sports term towards high in the list, these are very general terms, such as Women's Tennis Association versus NBA, which is men associated. So we kind of see different findings that now a little bit refute prior research, which focused on comparison of datasets that did not control for a variety of attributes. So next, our findings show that with matching, we don't see the difference in article lengths. The only difference that we find is that articles about Asian Americans tend to be shorter than articles about just unmarked or white Americans. While we don't see the difference, for example, in the length of articles about African American people or articles about Hispanic American people. And we show a lot more analysis in our paper. An interesting one, for example, in article length. Article age. So it kind of aligns with what Francesca mentioned, that recently there is more and more effort to create Wikipedia pages for women, for example. So we find also that in the new analysis, the articles about African American men, Asian American men, Hispanic American people, they're all kind of on average younger in months than articles about white American people. So there is a lot of, it shows a lot of recent effort in close the gaps and disparities in Wikipedia. In terms of numbers of languages, we see that articles about African American people and Asian American people are translated on average into less languages than articles about white American people or Hispanic American people. And an interesting property of our approach is also that we can focus on intersectionality. We can now compare articles about women, and we compare other disparities between the description of African American women versus unmarked American women. And we find that when we do intersectional analysis, the number of languages, for example, for translation of biographies for unmarked American women is significantly lower than the number of languages for white American women. So we find some disparities already in intersectional analysis that go beyond disparities between, for example, male versus women biographies. And this summarizes our findings. And I see that I have only, it's already been 20 minutes and I covered only half of my talk. I apologize. So just to go to, maybe I should just finish here and I can discuss the findings on NLP findings on how people, LGBT people are described in terms of power, agency, and sentiment offline, or just show the pointer to the paper. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry. I covered only half of my talk.
No worries. Thank you, Yulia, for the presentation. I hope we get a chance to visit some of these aspects during the discussion, or you have to come for a second round at a later point in time. No worries at all. For the audience, I want to encourage, if you have questions for Yulia, please put them in the chat. We'll relay them here, try to answer them. But I want to open it up for discussions. We still have time. So if you want to ask something, feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand.
I do have a question. Well, first, thanks, Julia, for sharing this work, and both of you, Julia and Francesca. I think this is an outstanding showcase. I'm very happy that you are not only providing some specific results of a study, but also providing this methodology to the Wikimedia Research Committee for doing this kind of control of social biases. Since you have been focusing on biographies, I'm wondering how hard would be the challenge to adapt this methodology to other purposes around Wikipedia articles and other topics like historical events, how to control biases in those kind of pages, or geographical territories?
This is a great question. So basically, our method is not really specific to focus on specific social attributes. So if there is, as I showed in the bottom of the Wikipedia page, there is a long list of possible attributes. So if there are attributes that correspond to a specific historical event, and there are sufficiently large corpus of articles that correspond to this event, that are describing this event, this would be kind of the same kind of methodology that can be used to identify a comparison set and then to focus on further analysis. So if you want to analyze articles about a specific historical event, and you want to just surface relevant articles, the same exact methodology can be used.
Okay, thanks, Julia.
And we released the demo and code, which can really speed up this analysis, I think. I don't know, maybe Angeli wants to add something. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I don't think I have anything to add. I mean, the method is pretty general for any set of attributes. So we could even use something other than categories. You could use something that's not related at all. Yeah, so I think it's sort of generalizable, keeping in mind what exactly you're trying to control for and whether or not you have the data for it.
Yeah.
I would ask a question then. That about when you construct a control group or specific, from times you look at labels for category labels, that for kind of the majority group, we know that for some categories or for some types of labels, these are just missing. So we might not know that certain article, just because it's such the majority label.
Yeah, that's
it is not explicitly labeled. So and I know it's a big problem there, or in many of the analysis when we are thinking how we could measure specific gaps. That's a common question. So I was curious to to hear. Maybe you addressed it and I missed, but
That's a great question. Yeah.
How would, like, what is your recommendation to deal with this, or what could be done in principle, even if you didn't address, or what's your thinking behind it?
Yeah. So if you noticed, I mentioned that I didn't show that we focus on white men, for example, compared to African American men. We focus on unmarked men, exactly for the reason because the majority group is typically not marked, and I don't know if we found that if we focus on, for example, specific occupations, then the unmarked group can be different. If we focus on sports occupations, then there will be the majority of Black players, and then Black will be unmarked. So we would not see Black basketball player. So I feel like a recommendation could be that instead of using one attribute, use several attributes that would help to disambiguate the unmarked category. But we didn't experience the same problem. I don't know if we have very concrete recommendations on how to populate the marking. Anjali, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's more work to do in this space. So this was definitely something we kind of spent a long time of, like, surprisingly difficult to try to identify articles about white people because there's nothing to indicate race in those articles. And so that was why we actually kind of explicitly focused on what was marked and what was not marked. And I think that we had sort of a lot of anecdotes, some of which we talk about in the paper, on areas where we're like, things were different, things were marked or not marked. So I think that there's sort of scope for a whole nother project that just focuses on this that we came across in our work, but I don't think we explored it to the full extent that it could be.
Yeah. I think just looking at the intersection of several categories could help disambiguate the marking. Also, linguistic use in other languages. Actually, I'm just brainstorming now based on your question. If in English, it can be unmarked, but Spanish, for example, Russian will mark gender and other properties just as a language. It has morphology, it has different morphology. So maybe using other languages to identify the attributes in English can be an interesting research direction.
Thank you for the answer. Isaac, you had a question, I think.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this work. I'm a big fan, and I'm thinking about the potential applications of this work to language modeling. And I'm thinking, so as you kind of remarked, there's like a long tail of articles often about, say, people in sports and things like that. And most language models, if they're training like a large, language understanding model, they'll just take Wikipedia in as a whole. And I'm wondering whether your model could be used maybe to weight articles or, so it's not overweighting on these kind of long tail articles, and whether you thought about any of the implications there for in that field.
Yeah, this was maybe where why we started this project in the first place, because this is where as NLP people we can make contribution. So there might be just balancing of the training corpus, reweighting of the training corpus that could mitigate subtle biases in data that would lead to much larger disparities. But also I think the second part, which I didn't have time to present, is more interesting, more important for language models specifically, because it shows that specific choices of verbs that describe people can have different implications on like future descriptions and future dialogue systems. So rather than figuring out how to mitigate it, so I think the mitigation has to happen at the data part. So maybe highlighting articles that describe people differently, and editing them can be a way to prevent from propagating these biases into language models. And also, an additional kind of NLP approach could be to monitor specifically for those verbs, those narratives in the output models, and using additional post-processing step for in controlled generation that would identify those verbs, specific linguistic choices, and post-process them a little bit to make the outputs more fair or more similar across different groups. So it's either data pre-processing or output post-processing with controlled generation.
Yeah, one thing I can add on top of that is that, so the second part of the second half part of the paper is about measuring power, sentiment, and activity of describe the person of the target in the bio. So we are measuring that, and we use this matching algorithm to find the matched person, and then compare whether which group is portrayed as more powerful compared to the other. And that's what we do in the second part. And what we see, what we want to note is that our model is not perfect. So it's quite noisy, because finding out this implied sentiment, implied power is a very hard question, and it's very subjective. So we don't really, in our paper, we don't really suggest people to rely on that number, but rather, use this to identify the articles that might benefit from editing. And then, we have to have this human in the loop to make sure that this is going to be helpful. So we're a little less confident to use this for any automatic approach to the bias, but still can be useful when the human is in the loop.
Great point. And we in the paper we show how to rank articles, how to rank them by different statistical properties, like in the first part, or by different sentiment, power, and agency of people that are described in the article, so we can identify outliers and focus on why these are outliers. And we show some examples in the paper. So it's more like the methodology here is a more important contribution than specific findings on which we are not really experts on. We are not social scientists, we are computer scientists.
Great, thanks for Isaac, you wanted to add? Otherwise I say thanks for the different components. And if Francesca, as a sociologist, I understand, wants to add something, feel free to chime in.
No, it's super interesting. I mean, I think I put this in the chat, right? I think your whole discussion about how finding marked pages of those who are considered non-marked, and the fact that it just wasn't feasible, right, is a really interesting finding just of itself. I think that alone could just be a paper. I put that in the chat.
When I was listening to Francesca's talk, I thought, wow, what an amazing work. This could be our work is so complementary, and
it really is.
We could really collaborate nicely.
Yeah, no, I would love to keep in touch and collaborate. We're doing this paper that's under review right now. We're also looking at race, and they use I can send you this paper. So there's an approach designed by the social scientists to predict race and ethnicity by using race classifier models, by training a network of they combined census data, voter registration data, and Wikipedia data to train a into identifying race ethnicity.
So race classification is actually a little bit problematic in our world.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, definitely. I mean, so this is a article that's looking at racial and ethnic inequality, and it's a deep learning approach that uses these various classifiers. And so, yeah, it's of course not perfect, because and even like manual evaluation obviously is not going to work because race is not necessarily like a visual, right? And also race is socially constructed, you know, I mean, the fact of the matter is, right, race exists as like a power dynamic. So it's definitely,
and it's also very, in our research, for example, it's very US centric, which can be very different for
gosh, that's itself just its own great paper. Sorry, I don't want to, I noticed some.
And just to comment on this, we specifically in our papers, we specifically did not infer, we did not use automatic techniques to infer race or sexuality, sexual orientation or gender. We only used what Wikipedia editor provided, Wikipedia editors provided as human labeled data.
In the article itself. So like it would say, and that's why you don't have, and that's why that you have that absence, right? Because no one's saying like,
no one would say it's white politician, white American
no one
politician.
says white.
They would only say it's a black.
Right. But it would be interesting, like, anyways, that we should definitely collaborate at some point.
Yes.
Super glad to hear that this seems to be a good fit. Pablo, I think there's a question from YouTube if you want to share it.
Yeah, and I'm so happy to see already people wanting to collaborate because of this showcase. It's exciting. So now that you were talking about labels and inference, there was one question in YouTube by Esther Bonnet about the need to use the label cisgender woman or cisgender man instead of using men and women.
But I didn't understand the question, unfortunately.
Yeah, like Esther is asking, maybe she did not understand it well, but why it is necessary to use the label cisgender woman on cisgender men and not to directly use women?
Just because we focused on multiple genders.
Yeah. We
focused on 5 genders.
Yeah. I think this is better explained in the second paper that is available in the web page of the showcase in ACL-USM. So I recommend the attendees to check both papers because they are really insightful. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you to Angela and Chan.
Pablo, was there another question on YouTube?
No.
Cool. Then I think Leila raised her hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to share my excitement, first of all, for this bit about collaborating potentially outside of this showcase. I would love to see that happening, or at least the two groups connecting. So thanks for sharing that with us on the fly here. I also want to just share the comment that, as you all know, knowledge equity is a focus for Wikimedia movement for 2030. Is one of the 2 main directions that the movement is focusing on. And of course, the issues around gender, bias, social biases remain at the center of how we can bring equity to the projects. So I very much want to encourage you all to continue to do the great work that you all have been doing. I also want to say, and this comment actually is to both groups of presenters that I'm sharing. I think you all are working on some of the hardest and most important problems that we are facing as a movement, the issue of bias and how to detect bias, whether it's from the qualitative side or quantitative side. These are really hard problems. I've seen firsthand how difficult this is for getting publications out, and I empathize with both groups on like having the work published and continuing to push on this front on the different academic venues that you have been working with. So I want to thank you for your persistence and for sticking to this topic. Again, both on the theoretical front and also on the qualitative front. We just heard snippets of how difficult this work is. And in practice, I know that both groups have experienced and have gone through a lot of work and difficulty for making this research happen. So thank you so much to you, Yulia, Anjali, Chan, and Francesca for all the work that you have been doing. And please keep it up.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
I would think there could not be a better comment than to close the showcase than this. I think we're also at time. I think thanks for sharing this, Leila. I totally agree with what you mentioned. Let's wrap up here. I think there's lots of threads to continue to discuss and to continue to interact. It's very nice to see. I want to thank Francesca and Julia and Anjali and Chan for joining us today, for the excellent presentation and engaging in the discussion. That was really interesting. I want to thank also everyone who joined and took part in a very great discussion. Great to see so much interest and so many questions. And finally, I want to thank Pablo and Emerald for the technical support. Thanks for making this happen, the showcase. Without you, this would not, we wouldn't know how to do this. So great to have you and support us. And with this, I hope to see you in the next showcase in June. There will be next edition. We'll share the program very soon. And with this, I hope you have a good rest of today. Bye, everyone.